So I was going to, I guess the way to put this up, the next speaker that we're going to have is a company called Portal. And what they are doing supports Bitcoin trade in an unstoppable fashion through atomic swaps. And they will explain exactly what that is. So I'd actually like to call up Chandra Duggirala, he's the CEO of Portal, and Eric Martindale, who has been from Blockstream and BitPay, who's been working on this technology along with Portal. So I'm going to bring you guys up. Chandra.
I have been told that after this, there's the panel with some exchanges, founders of custodian companies, and some venture capitalists as well. So I'm going to start by making a very cheerful prediction, which is Bitcoin is going to fail, and that custodians and centralized exchanges are going to kill it. Because uncensorable money needs unstoppable exchange. My name is Chandra, and I'm the founder of Portal. We have a goal of developing products that take Bitcoin to 1 billion people, products that people actually love to use and want to use, and the goal is to make Bitcoin unstoppable. But before we get there, we have to take a step back and ask ourselves, can we actually create a new money? Well, if we can create a new money, how can we do it? The first thing we can do is, if you're a government, you have unlimited guns and power, you point them at a lot of people, and you force them basically to use your money, no matter how super high quality it is. Or if you have unlimited patience, you can actually wait for a commodity to evolve into a money, a commodity with the best monetary properties. But if you don't want to wait a few hundred years or 1,000 years, Bitcoin has no options. Kinda, right? So pay attention. I'm actually going to show you the secret map of how Bitcoin becomes money. In fact, it is so secret that it is programmed right into the protocol. Are you ready? It is this graph. It's quite simple, actually. It is the price hash rate spirals, or we call them speculative cycles. Increasingly larger speculative cycles is how monetization of Bitcoin happens. Every time there's an increase in demand, there's an increase in price that brings in more hash rate because of the profit opportunity for miners, and so on and so on. And this is going to go on, bringing more people and more money into the system until Bitcoin becomes money. The thing that powers this transition, the engine that powers this journey of Bitcoin to becoming a generally accepted medium of exchange is trade. But the problem is almost all of trade today flows through centralized exchanges. And as George has touched on, and I think maybe Tim might have touched on this a little bit as well, they are a systemic vulnerability. They are a systemic threat to the adoption of Bitcoin. And that is precisely because, I can make the academic argument, but I'll give you the gist of it. When the big bad government wants to come for your Bitcoin, what do you think they'll do? I'll give you an example of what actually was done in India recently. They didn't like the fact that Bitcoin is competing with their favorite son, which is their local Indian rupee. And they didn't try to exploit a BGP vulnerability and do a network level attack. They didn't actually start secretly mining and do a 51% attack. They didn't do any of those things. They just shut down exchanges and then pretty much took away all of the trade of Bitcoin in India. The more academic argument is they compromise censorship resistance because they can actually censor transactions. If you and I are just exchanging IOUs, that the exchange tells you have 5 Bitcoin, I have 7 Bitcoin, that's just an IOU, it's just an entry in their database. It is not on-chain data. If they hold your Bitcoin for you, we're all just trading in scripts or banknotes, so to speak. And they mean nothing. They can arbitrarily seize your account and confiscate your Bitcoin. Even, whether it's malicious or under threat from a government, who knows? The second thing is decentralization. If these big economic nodes start to hold a lot of users' Bitcoin in custody, and if they're the only ones, or maybe at least one of the few that are accepting Bitcoin, the one who accepts Bitcoin, the merchants are the ones who enforce the rules. And those who enforce the rules get to change the rules. So this makes a situation like the New York agreement, where a bunch of big players got in a room and decided to change the rules of the protocol, much more likely, and it's also going to make it more likely to succeed. From a user perspective, nobody wants to remember like 17 different login credentials, passwords, two-factor auths on like a whole bunch of devices. It's not a good experience, but that's the best we got. So what do we do? Do we do decentralized exchanges? Well, the good news is they've been dead on arrival. They've never taken off. This is the volume of DEX trades versus centralized exchanges. They've never actually exceeded 0.05% of centralized exchange trade volume. Intuitively, most of you who've ever tried to use decentralized exchanges know this, that the experience sucks. And why does it suck? Well, they have no good wallet integration. They can't do trades of assets across chains. They're prone to front running and order cancellations, et cetera, because they expose the order data at every node. On-chain transactions, they're very slow, bad UX, they're messy, and rightfully, they haven't taken off. So should we just try to fix the DEXs? I actually think we should be done with DEXs and move on. And the reason why is we don't really need decentralized exchange. What we need is trust-minimized exchange. The problem with centralization is that for a fair exchange, you and I need to give our asset custody to somebody else who then facilitates that swap. The problem when you decentralize the exchange is that you lose the benefits of centralized exchanges, like speed, liquidity, user experience. And those are why we even go to an exchange in the first place. So with DEXs, you get trust minimization, but you lose everything else. That's kind of not the point. In fact, we want to preserve these benefits of centralized exchanges. Right? It's a two-sided marketplace. More buyers on one side, more sellers on the other side. Each side benefits the other. That's the classic two-sided network effect. In fact, it's the prototypical study of network effects in economics. We want to preserve that. We want to just trust minimize that process. And how do we do that? Do we have the tools? Well, some of the tools have existed for a long time, starting with the Tier-Nolan atomic swap. This dates back to 2013 Bitcoin Talk Forum by a gentleman or someone named Tier-Nolan. And this construction basically is quite simple. Alice has some Ethereum. She wants to buy Bitcoin. And Bob has Bitcoin. He wants to buy ETH. What Alice does is she takes her ETH, locks her ETH in a smart contract using a secret that she randomly generates, and uses the hash of that pre-image to lock up her Bitcoin with the following conditions. Within a day, actually within 2 days, Bob can reveal the secret that Alice only has and take her Ethereum, or after 2 days, she can refund it back. It's called HTLC, or hash time lock contract. Then she passes the hash of that secret to Bob, who locks up his Bitcoin in the same thing on the Bitcoin blockchain, another HTLC, using the hash of the same secret with the condition that within a day, Alice can claim his Bitcoin, but to do so, she needs to reveal the pre-image. If she doesn't, Bob can refund his Bitcoin back in a day. Then the swap is triggered when Alice simply claims Bob's Bitcoin. To do so, she has to reveal the secret. And now Bob knows the secret. He has a day to take that, at least a day to take that, and then claim Alice's Ether, right? So assets changed hands. Nobody held custody. They were both held on on-chain smart contracts. The problem is, every discussion of these Tier-Nolan swaps starts with a lot of hand-waving and assuming away that people who want to trade have somehow found each other, right? They've agreed to trade. They've agreed on the order size. They've agreed on the price. And then now let's just discuss the problems with the transaction construction. That's kind of like saying a lot of people want taxi rides. A lot of drivers have idle capacity. Let's just find the best way to process these payments. Screw the user experience. Uber wouldn't exist. The second problem with Tier-Nolan swap is, if you remember back to the timing, Alice, for 1 day, had the option to claim Bob's Bitcoin by revealing her secret. But she's under no obligation to do anything, right? She can purchase an asset for a fixed cost on or up to a specific date. If you're versed in finance, you know that it's called an option. It's called an American call option, to be more specific. And options aren't free, they have a price. It's called a premium. Nowhere in this protocol does Alice actually pay the premium. So the free option is a source of inefficiency in the tier-Nolan swap, and liquid markets don't like inefficiency. Second thing is this thing called liquidity trolling or lockup griefing. So let's say Alice had every intention of following through with her commitment. She's a nice person. She intends to finish the swap. So she locks up her ETH for 2 days, takes her pre-image hash, passes it to Bob, and Bob is just going to smoke a joint and Netflix, right? He's not going to do anything. He doesn't need to lock up his Bitcoin in an HTLC. So he essentially has tricked or trolled Alice into locking up her liquidity for 2 days for free. The other problem with tier-Nolan swaps or cross-chain swaps is that I wanted to say the UX is terrible, but there isn't even a UX, so there's not much to talk about. So the goal, so what we do is we want to make, or we've actually made cross-chain atomic swaps as easy to use as Coinbase, and they're integrated right into your local multi-currency wallet. So there's no complications. I'm going to give this to Eric, my friend, to actually show you how this works from a UX level and give you a little bit of the mechanics. And then I'll finish up as to what properties it gives you and what benefits you get as a user.
Awesome. Thanks, Chandra. All right, so my name's Eric Martindale. I do see some familiar faces in the audience, but I've been working in a space for a while. I got the fortunate opportunity of actually being invited to go work at BitPay originally at the end of 2013. For those of you counting, that was when the price, I believe it was went from about $250 to $1,200. And so this was kind of the moment, right? I had been the crazy uncle for, a couple years before that. My parents almost kicked me out of Thanksgiving dinner because all I wanted to talk about was how Bitcoin was going to be the future, and all I wanted to do is talk to the local businesses and convince them to accept Bitcoin because this dirty state script surely wasn't going to stick around for a while. So I had all sorts of high hopes and aspirations, and I really wanted to figure out how do we properly decentralize these ideas, right? How do we take the existing applications that are suffering from what I saw to be counterparty risk, the aggregation of personally identifying information in central points, where rather than an attacker, going around and stealing the wallets of every single one of you, all they have to do is one fell swoop into the big honeypot, and it was easy. At BitPay, I actually had the opportunity to work on some really cool projects. I was responsible for open source while I was there. We got the opportunity when the sidechains white paper came across. We wrote one of the first implementations. We announced it as ChainDB. Not to that much fanfare because I don't really think the industry had sophisticated far enough at that time. But we also worked on a precursor to the Lightning Network using these concepts called payment channels and the HTLCs that Chandra kind of talked about, called the Impulse Network. And, I really got the exposure and the opportunity to work with some really cool people, but the business bent, like trying to go down the direction, ended up with a lot of our open source work just not receiving the attention and the focus that it deserved, right? A business has to make money, and so BitPay went on to focus on payment processing. So I took the summer of 2015 to found Fabric Labs as an attempt to solve this problem. And so when my friend Chandra actually reached out to me, he had seen some of our work, some of the approaches that we were going to take. And I'm a very technically oriented person, right? I started with the engineering aspect. So I came at it from the engineering perspective, but just like I told Roger Ver in 2014, and because I was frustrated with, having to wait a certain number of confirmations for a transaction to be secure. I was like, there's no way that a user is going to wait around for any amount of time, let alone 6 confirmations for the thermodynamic security that you want out of a system. So I said, Roger, man, user experience is the #1 thing that we got to solve. Hey, we have to solve it. And he kind of nodded and laughed a little bit, sure enough. But Chandra, he had a user experience focus. So what we did is we went ahead and used some of our technology. You're going to see Alice and Bob here. We're looking at Bob. He's got a Bitcoin balance. Now, these are what we call layer 3 contracts, okay? So layer 1 we look at as the settlement layer. This is where Bitcoin is bonded into layer 2 HTLCs. These are your smart contracts. These are the mechanisms that you can use to instantaneously make a transfer to someone. So here we have Alice. She is going to offer up some of her Ethereum into this layer 3 contract. She already has a balance here at layer 2. So this is a payment channel that's established with the network. She's going to set her pricing information based on what she perceives to be a good price, because this is a startup and we don't have a full order book yet. So that order goes into our order book. You'll see that the amount that she's bonded is actually 110 ETH here. The price is specified by the total amount of Bitcoin that she's requesting to purchase. So we're switching over to Bob right now. Bob does a very similar thing. And he's going to click this accept swap button, which is going to fill out the opposite side of the trade using his layer 2 balance. Now, the innovation that we've done here is, how do we protect the privacy of these users? How do we actually ensure that these people they're protected in the same trust minimized fashion that we're looking for? So I'll get into the technicals here in just a second, and I'm going to cover it as quickly as I can, but we're open to questions afterwards, so give me just a minute. What are the properties that we're looking for, right? We want deterministic execution, right? We want to be sure that this program executes exactly as the traders are expecting, that the order book is sorted appropriately, but that the pricing information is not revealed, okay? What we don't want for this sort of generalized computation thing that we're building is we don't want those messages to be passed around to everybody. We don't want everybody in the network to be computing every contract. That would be terribly inefficient. We also want all of the properties that a traditional exchange might have, which include order aggregation, so taking multiple orders from many different places and pulling them together. And we want partial filling, right? So a Bitcoin transaction is not going to be valid until the sum of the outputs is equal to the sum of the inputs. So how do we do this? Briefly, I talked about this. We push all of the payments into layer 2, and we just simply rely on the layer 1 as the finalized settlement engine. This is very similar to the other layer 2 systems that you're going to see on the internet, including Lightning, most sophisticatedly. On the Ethereum side, I haven't actually really heard that much out of it, but there is also Raiden. And I also consider other side chains, such as Rootstock, to be layer 2 systems, because they do ultimately connect to a base layer. So we've designed something called the ZK swap. And what that is a zero knowledge, that's the ZK piece. While it runs, I'm going to just kind of skip forward here. So what you're about to observe is a distributed contract which is being run by multiple parties in the network. I'm going to just speed it up here just so we have the time. So what you're observing is the actual network executing the slices, the pieces of what's called a MPC, or multi-party contract, where the higher order program, probably written in a programming language that you're familiar with, is compiled down into a layer 2 circuit, where members of an open network are able to compete with one another for computing portions of that contract. Now, because we use a property called homomorphism, which is the ability to encrypt a piece of information, pass it off to someone else as encrypted information, run some program over that encrypted information without ever decrypting it or revealing to the party who's computing that, and then return an encrypted solution back to the original requester, okay? And in doing so, we create something called a zero knowledge contingent payment, where because I can prove that I executed this encrypted program correctly, I executed the multi-party circuit correctly, I can lay claim to some funds that were originally offered up by the creators of this transaction. This is the fundamental idea behind Fabric, a layer 3 system. So you're actually seeing the transaction being created here, composed, and then broadcasted out to the layer 2 network as those parties facilitate that trade. So what this does is you'll see Charlie being added here, and Charlie is actually able to see these orders, and now they're partially filled. On Bitcoin, we have something called sig hash single, which is a signature mode, which allows us to only have one input in the transaction, which is signed. And then we use another part of Bitcoin that allows us to have only one of the outputs signed. But we can also set the total amount in the transaction, so it's not considered a valid transaction on the Bitcoin chain until it has those inputs and those outputs have been filled. So our zero-knowledge circuit here, what its responsibility is aggregating these orders in an encrypted way, sorting them, breaking them down into fundamental units, what we call the unit type, and then ultimately computing what the final solution for this distributed contract is without ever revealing any of the underlying components. So with that, open up to questions afterwards, but I'm going to hand it back to Chandra at this point.
Thank you, Eric. That blows my mind every time I watch it. So I want to talk a little bit about what this system does from the technical properties, right? First thing is we talked about facilitation, right? We hand wave away facilitation. Nobody ever thinks about it in the tier null and atomic swap. In this system, Charlie, the executor that he was describing, is a neutral third-party facilitator whose rational economic interest is to facilitate a swap between parties he doesn't know. And why does he do that? Because he actually gets paid only when he executes the swap. Any other branch, any other use case, any other possibility where the swap can go wrong is zero revenue generating. So there's an incentive built into the protocol to facilitate swaps. And anybody can do this. Anybody who provides resources to provide the circuit, execute the orders, do the sort, can do this, and they get paid a fee. And so essentially, you're creating a market in facilitating atomic swaps. There is no off-chain identity or reputation that you depend on. You don't need to know who they are. If you execute the protocol correctly, your funds will be safe, no matter who they are. And they can be completely anonymous or pseudonymous. And because they're anonymous, you don't know if the counterparty is acting as the role of the executor as well. Are they colluding? Are there two distinct parties? Sybil attacks? We don't know. We don't really care, because two out of three parties, Alice colluding with the exchange, can't steal Bob's coins. Bob colluding with the exchange can't steal Alice's coins. Alice and Bob can't collude to screw the exchange out of its rightful exchange fee. And there is no free option here because the cost of the option is internalized into the swap itself. There's two ways to eliminate the free option problem. One, you have to eliminate the option itself, which you can't do in cross-chain because completely closed blockchains, they don't communicate with each other. One chain doesn't know what's happening on the other chain. But what we've done here is we've internalized the cost of the option. So Alice actually pays the premium for the option that she's getting for the swap, but she actually doesn't have to calculate the price of the option or the premium. You know, who's here ever done like, you know, binomial options pricing or Black-Scholes or stochastic pricing? I mean, I've never done it. Nobody wants to do it. As a user, you don't really care, right? Here, the facilitator is actually incentivized to accurately price the option, because if he prices it too high, Alice is not going to buy. If he prices it too low, Bob is not going to take. And because the only revenue-generating case is a successful swap, that burden is offloaded to the facilitator, who's also incentivized to do it. So that's actually what we can do today with cross-chain atomic swaps using just the assets on these blockchains. But the future is going to be many different arbitrarily complex financial instruments built on top of these blockchains. Futures, derivatives, options, who knows what else, right? I can't even imagine. Stuff will be built. The one thing they all have in common is that they need a trust-minimized layer of exchange or unstoppable exchange, and that's what our goal is to build. So I want to summarize by saying uncensorable money needs unstoppable exchange. That's our goal. We want to make it easy enough for everybody to use and make a product that people love to use. All of the, most of the building blocks to do this have been available for a while, but you need to put that together and productize it in a way that is delightful, easy, simple, accessible to users, and it's ready now. Thank you.